Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the readings for the 25th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 33, also known as Proper 28, which this year falls on the 14th of November.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive today is about the classification of the books of the Bible. Now, as you might imagine, there are a few different types of books in the Bible, and there are a variety of genres found within each of those books. So let's start by talking about the Hebrew Scriptures. The Jewish people divide the Hebrew Scriptures into three sections according to importance. The first being the Torah, or the Law, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The second section that they have is the prophets, and that includes Isaiah and Jeremiah, as you might imagine, along with the 12 minor prophets, but also includes who they would call the former prophets, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which include several stories about prophets. And then finally, the third section, which is of the least importance to the Jewish people, is called the Writings, and that includes things like Psalms and Proverbs, Job, Ruth, Esther, and Chronicles, interestingly enough, which Christians put in a slightly different place. If you've ever looked at a table of contents for a Christian Bible versus a table of contents for the Jewish Hebrew Scriptures, you'll notice that the order is very different. The Christian Bible tends to sort the books not exactly in a chronological order, because Job is definitely the oldest of them all, and yet it doesn't come first, and gee, that's probably a good thing, because man, if I opened a Bible and the first thing I found was the book of Job, I'm not entirely sure I'd keep going.
Yeah.
But in those books you will find prophecy, which in the Bible is sharing God's will with the people, saying God's words to the people, rather than telling the future.
Which, if you have any questions about prophecy, we'll link to our deep dive from last Advent when we deep dove into prophecy versus prophecy.
Yes. And also you'll find things like wisdom literature, which includes Job and Ecclesiastes. So you'll find prophecy in, again, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, the minor prophets. Jonah is definitely a book of satire. And of course you'll also find plenty of poetry, including the Psalms and the Song of Songs. And so you've got lots of different genres going on in the Hebrew Scripture.
Mm-hmm. And when collected all together, the Hebrew Scriptures are referred to as the Tanakh, and that takes the first letter of each of those 3 sections that Kay was talking about and puts them together to form a word. So Torah takes the T, and then the prophets that Kay was talking about is referred to as the Nevi'im. There's an N there. And this is
Which is the Hebrew word for prophets, as you might imagine.
Yes. And this is all, right, the letters that we're talking about, we're talking about the English letters, but they're actual Hebrew letters that we're not going to get into right now. But then the writings are the Ketuvim, and that has the K. So it's Tanakh. If you're spelling it, it's Tanakh. But yeah, I really like the Ketuvim, just the diversity in it, right? Because it has like Psalms, but it also has like erotic poetry in the Song of Songs, right. And it has apocalyptic prophecy in Daniel,
and you've got Job, the weirdest parable ever.
Yes, and Lamentations and Ruth and Esther, and yeah, some of my favorites, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And then the New Testament, the way that I kind of think about splitting up the New Testament is to have the first 4 books of the New Testament are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark being the oldest, John being the youngest.
And Matthew and Luke are the middle brothers.
Yes. And then Acts, which kind of goes through the early church, followed by epistles, which are also sometimes called the letters. There are kind of the bigger ones, and then there are some smaller ones that I think we find after Hebrews.
Sure. Also, epistles is just a fancy word for letters. Like, they mean the same thing. Yeah.
Yes. And then the final book is Revelation. Once again, a reminder that it's Revelation, not Revelations. There's only one. It's really long. And so I think I was talking to a friend, and we were talking about the different ways that the lectionary is organized. And the way that we currently organize the lectionary in the Christian church really doesn't do justice to the fullness of the Bible, because the Hebrew scriptures get so little space. Hebrew scriptures actually are the majority of the Bible, of the Christian Bible. And we have like one reading and a psalm. And the one reading frequently is much shorter than the gospel. The gospels get the most attention, and the New Testament broadly, because it has both the gospels and the epistles. So you could also, I was talking to Pace about this, who's a Luther scholar and is a friend of the podcast and a co-host of our sister podcast, Horror Nerds at Church. And they were suggesting doing an organization that kind of spans, that doesn't demarcate as clearly Hebrew scripture versus the Christian New Testament. And so separating passages up to have a reading that's from the Torah or one of the historical books. So it could be the Torah, it could be Acts, it could also be Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. And then one that is the prophets, which would include Revelation, because Revelation is kind of a subgenre within the prophets. And then one reading that's the gospel, and one reading that's theological. So that could be the Psalms, epistles, Job, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, those sorts of books, which I really like that sort of way of blending that, because it gets at, there are more historical books and books that tell a particular type of history within the Bible, and that includes a lot of books in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and it also includes Acts. And then similarly, the prophets are this bigger genre that Kay talked about in the Nevi'im, but it also includes Revelation, and Revelation is part of the subgenre of prophets that's categorized as apocalyptic or apocalypse. So that would include Daniel, which we'll read today, and Revelation, some parts of Isaiah. There's Mark 13 is kind of called the little apocalypse. But that there are a lot of different ways that we can kind of split up and classify the Bible. And it's important to recognize, especially the part that the Bible is made up of different books from different genres. So it's not all one genre. It's not meant to be all historical. It's not meant to be all satire. Jonah is definitely satire, but that there's a lot more diversity in.
And I could swear that a couple of Jesus's lines are delivered as satire, but, it's not actually, marked that way. So it turns out
That's
they
true.
didn't have a satire font in ancient Hebrew, which would have been super useful, or in
That
ancient
would
Greek.
have been
But
really handy. Yeah. But I also think one of the things about recognizing the diversity of the books of the Bible is recognizing that there are things like Song of Songs, which has a lot of imagery that we're not familiar with today, but is actually erotic poetry. And so what does it look like to have that? Or Ruth and Esther, who feel more historic, but are realistically probably made up stories that tell a truth about the world, but not necessarily a historical fact about people and ancestors. Yeah. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more appreciation for the diversity of scripture. Also, I'll just throw out there that a lot of the books of the Bible are also very similar to books in the Quran. So if you ever want to have a really extra interesting Bible study, I would compare the stories in the English interpretation of the Quran, unless you know Arabic, with the English version of that story that's found in the Bible, because there are some similarities and some differences, and I think it would.
Yeah. One of my favorites is that in the Quran, when Jesus is born, he's born under a palm tree. And I'm sure that there's poetical imagery to that I don't understand, but it just, given the option of imagining Mary giving birth in a crowded, dark stable versus giving birth under a palm tree, out in the fresh air, that sounds a little more pleasant. So,
I mean, yes, and
possibly
Mary was also surrounded by
kind of depends on what the day was like.
Community. Yeah. My favorite part of that is and one of the things that I think is most important to look at from the Quran is actually the relationship between Hagar and Sarah and Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac, because that's where, when we talk about the Abrahamic traditions, we're talking about Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all tracing back to Abraham, Islam tracing back through Hagar, and Judaism and Christianity tracing through Sarah. There's a lot in those stories to check out. So feel free to check that out. I think it'd be a really great Bible study if you're looking at getting deeper into those stories. Just as we are going to get deeper into some of the stories for today. So our first reading is from Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The author, writing a symbolic prophecy about the end of all things, speaks of a time of anguish followed by the bodily resurrection and final judgment. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of deliverance. And I was thinking about when people are delivered, and there's a lot of different ways that deliverance happens, and there are big deliverances where it's like, finally the oppressive government is overthrown, and there are smaller deliverances. And one of my favorite deliverances is in the book Catching Fire, which is the second Hunger Games book, when the victors break out of the 75th Hunger Games. Right as that is happening, then Gale, Katniss's best friend, delivers District 12. So he helps save District 12, those who are willing to take a risk with him, because he gets them out of the district right before they're bombed by the Capitol in retaliation for the victors breaking out of the Hunger Games. So I like that because he doesn't like get them out and safe forever, and it's not the end of things, but it is this small deliverance within the larger context of a struggle for freedom.
Yeah. So both of my comments for this passage are on the same verse, just on different pieces of the verse.
Me too, but a different verse.
Yay!
Which is good.
We managed to look at different verses this time. Always a good sign. And so my first comment is on the first part of verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. Maybe he's been hiding as a ranger in the forest. Or maybe he needs a fairy godmother to dress him up so he can go to a ball and fall in love with a princess. We don't know how he's going to show up. But, well, yeah, sure. So I was just trying to make the Cinderella vibe as strong as possible.
Yeah.
We don't know how this arising will wind up looking in the end, but it might be based on other stories that we already know. You never know.
Mm-hmm. That would be fun.
Yes. And, like, getting to go to a ball and dress up would probably be more fun than hiding as a ranger in the forest, because while Aragorn seemed to enjoy it, it's not everyone's cup of tea.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the second half of verse 1, but at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. And I like to think this is less like an elite club with a specified guest list and more like, a census. And so yeah. I would like to encourage you to remember to participate in the census and campaign for it to be more accessible to everyone, because while I'm quite sure that this particular situation being delivered by everyone who's found written in the book is not based on the American census, the American census still does good things, and you should still participate.
It's true, even if Kay's reminder to participate is either a year too late or 9 years early. Just mark it on your calendars now. It happens every decade.
Yes, and there's a mini one every 5 years.
Really?
In between times, yes.
Oh, I didn't know
that. It's less noticed and therefore even more important to participate in.
Mm-hmm.
But it's sort of an update at the 5-year mark.
Nice. So similar to Kay, both of my things are from verse 3. But the first part of verse 3, we read, "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars." And it reminded me of dark skies. So the concept of a dark sky is it's a place where there's not light pollution, which is actually increasingly difficult to find on Earth. And the best kind of dark sky is the kind at a new moon, where the moon is dark as well, because the darker the sky, the brighter the stars, or galaxies, which is what they probably all actually are, or most of them anyway. But yeah, I love outer space, and so I love looking at the sky when it's dark out and seeing all the stars shining forever and ever. And then in verse 3b, we read that, "And those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." And it just reminded me of Moulin Rouge when Christian sings to Satine in Elephant Love Medley, "We could be heroes forever and ever." And it kind of goes on, and I won't sing the whole thing for you all because I don't want to do that to your ears, but I do love the Moulin Rouge soundtrack. It is when driving across the country, if I'm getting a little tired, I put Moulin Rouge in, and then I'm good for a long while, and I just sing at the top of my lungs. Yeah.
Our second reading for this episode is from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 11 through 14 and 19 through 25, and possibly also including verses 15 through 18, depending on whether your congregation feels like being inclusive or not. I suppose. The book of Hebrews is filled with worshipful and sacrificial imagery for Jesus, pointing to the power of Christ's death and resurrection to accomplish forgiveness, which prompts us to do good works in loving response.
So one of the themes for this passage is the idea of faithful promises. There are lots of ways that we do and don't make faithful promises, but in The Book Thief, which is a book that I really enjoy and a movie that I recently watched, Liesel, the main character, is a young girl in Nazi Germany, and she is adopted by this older couple, and they are not part of the Nazi Party. And so she is mostly faithful in her promise to them to not tell anyone about Max Vandenberg, who has shown up because his dad had fought in the war with Liesel's dad, foster dad, adoptive dad. And so he had promised to be there for Max's family if they needed anything. And so Max Vandenberg, who is Jewish, shows up, and they keep Max in the basement and hide him in the basement. And so Liesel has to keep it a secret to keep Max safe and to keep their whole family safe. And she does pretty good. She has one best friend who sometimes they talk about some stuff, but she's good at keeping him a secret, keeping Max a secret.
Sure.
Keep it secret, keep it safe.
And then in verse 13 we read, "And since then has been waiting until his enemies would be made a footstool for his feet." This is a great verse to point at as an example of the importance of remembering that the Bible, like much great literature, uses poetic imagery on a fairly regular basis and is not always entirely literal. Otherwise, this would be the worst footstool ever. And I play The Sims, I have seen some ugly footstools. But
also, feet are gross, and even Jesus feet can't be all that pleasant. I don't like feet.
Okay. Yes.
So I would not want to be a footstool for Jesus' feet.
Right. Also, worst footstool ever. But yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I don't think you'd really want to be a chair for Jesus either.
Also true. That'd be really hard.
Or, yeah.
What if he farted?
Well, I think with the general idea that I'm going with, you'd be dead, so you wouldn't care.
That's fair.
What was the assumption I was making? And in verse 22, we read, "Let us approach with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water." So remember, folks, if you find a door hidden behind a bookcase, boarded up with a sign on it that says "Do not open under any circumstances," and you open it anyway because you're the Arch-Chancellor of Unseen University and you think everything exists for you to, open and use, and then you find out that it's a bathing room labeled as having been designed by, and I quote, "Bloody Stupid Johnson," and then you decide to try some of the knobs and levers. Even if you are the Arch-Chancellor of Unseen University, it might not be the greatest idea, because in that particular case, in, I believe it was The Last Continent book of the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, he will have wound up clean and experienced fantastic water pressure, but also somewhat traumatized. That was a bathing room that basically had faucets that were labeled things like Old Faithful and Mount Vesuvius, and it was very enthusiastic bathing.
Wow.
Yeah. So may have been why it was boarded up in the first place. Just saying.
Mm-hmm.
But given the fact that this Bible verse describes having your heart sprinkled clean and bodies washed with pure water, I'm pretty sure the stuff that's being sprinkled on the hearts, according to the previous verses, is Jesus's blood. So that sounded pretty traumatizing too. So This kind of occurred to me as a similar concept.
Yeah. Kind of creepy, kind of traumatizing. Agreed. Yeah. And then in verse 24, we read, "And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds." And provoking is not usually what I think of when I think of good deeds. But when it comes to Tahani al-Jamil from The Good Place, yes, it would be so very easy to provoke her to good deeds, because that's like the whole thing.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in verse 25, we read, "Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." So shout out to our deep dive on spirituality and religion, which we'll link to, is the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, which you may or may not have heard in your worshiping communities because it fell on the 31st of October, which is also Reformation Day. But this idea of meeting together, and Kay and I talked about that, some of the ways that religion intentionally puts you in community and has that accountability space, but also the ways that spirituality can be made to do that. So that was interesting. Also, meeting together in a pandemic, none of this has to be in person.
Right.
It could be virtual meeting together. Kay and I meet together to record the podcast every week-ish.
Virtually.
Yes, we meet virtually. But also I was thinking about the council in Graceling who are working to mitigate the harm of corrupt kings and rulers. And so the council itself in Graceling does not neglect to meet together. They meet together on a regular basis to make sure that they know what's going on and can respond as needed.
Yeah.
Yay to them. And then our gospel reading for this episode is Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. The week before Jesus is executed, he challenges his disciples' wonder at the grandeur of the temple and warns them of tough times to come. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of signs, that Jesus says there will be signs, and also we don't know the signs. And it reminded me of the book Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor. I'm not positive I'm pronouncing that right because I have not heard it. I've just read it. But the protagonist, Onyesunwu, is herself a sign in the book. And then even as she is following the signs and trying to figure out what's going on and what her purpose is, she is simultaneously a sign and a sign seeker and one who finds signs. Cool. I really like the book. It's like a post-apocalyptic lit.
Sure.
Yeah. And then in verse 1, we read, "As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Look, teacher, what large stones and what large building.'" And it sounds like Laia in A Reaper at the Gates from the Ember in the Ashes series when she gets to Odessa to see the great library. And it's this awe and wonder at this building, and she loves stories, and so it's especially awesome to her. And I think it's inspired by the Great Library of Alexandria, but cool. Just that like awe. Also, as I was reading it out loud, it reminded me of Little Red Riding Hood saying to the wolf.
Oh my goodness.
Little Red Riding Hood saying to the wolf grandma, "My, what large eyes you have, what large teeth you have, what large stones and what large buildings."
See, the direction my brain went was definitely Wicked, with the song where Galinda and Elphaba arrive in the Emerald City for the first time, and they're all excited and looking around.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Yeah. And then in verse 4, we read, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" And I have to say that if you're literally standing there with Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, wanting an instruction manual for the end of the world is actually a perfectly reasonable thing to go for. Like, this seems like a perfectly reasonable question to me, as these things go. But when I was thinking about what book have I read that would be like an instruction manual for the end of the world, the first thing that came to mind was definitely World War Z. That is not the direction that the Bible predicts things will go. There are no zombies in the end of the world in the Bible. There
Except
are
for
sort of
potentially
zombies
Jesus,
in
but
the Bible,
we kind of
but
decided that Jesus was not a zombie.
Right. No, Jesus is not a zombie. I was about to say that there were no zombies in the Bible, and then I remembered the story of the Valley of Dry Bones and realized, oops. So, yeah.
Although I did watch World War Z for a class in seminary. So
interesting. Okay. I have not seen the movie. I've only read the book. But
have not read the book, only seen the movie.
And then in verse 6, we read, "Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray." And I kind of wonder if this verse means that when Jesus comes back, he won't announce himself at all, and we have to just figure it out. Like, there's that whole coming in the clouds thing in the Bible, but I'm not entirely convinced that Jesus coming back is something that will be like hugely announced. This verse and a few other places kind of make it seem like we're supposed to, what if we're supposed to be looking for and finding him? And is that why it's taken 2,000 years? Because he keeps getting reincarnated and is wandering around, doing usual Jesus stuff, and no one has noticed because everyone expects him to come on a cloud with trumpets.
That's fascinating because it
That would
also,
explain a lot.
it would, and it reminds me of all of those memes of like, that mostly non-Christians legitimately say about Christians of like, if Jesus actually came back, like y'all wouldn't let him in the front door of your building.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's a new theological point I'll probably be pondering for a couple of weeks at least.
Yeah.
And then it also reminded me of in the October Day series by Seanan McGuire, it reminded me of the return of Oberon, King of the Fae, who does not announce himself, mostly because he doesn't know that he is himself due to magic and such. And so he returns, but he does so without fanfare or indeed most people knowing about it in order to not cause general chaos. And does so in a very understated way, which is really not a thing that the Fae people do, like understated anything in these books. So it's kind of unusual.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and I read verse 6 as well and was thinking about those who come and claim, I am he, and then they will lead many astray. And in the Warcross books, spoiler alert, in the Warcross books, Hideo Tanaka claims to be this person who needs Amika Chen's help and who's doing this really good thing, which like, I don't know, we just have to stop trusting billionaires who lead technological companies, but claims to be like doing this good thing and in danger of being hacked, and actually ends up leading Amika Chen astray because Hideo claims that he's on the good side, and then it turns out that he's actually like doing something super problematic for a lot of people. So don't be like Hideo.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Reign of Christ Sunday with our special guest, Reverend Kelsey Brown. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christian said,
Pax vobiscum.